I'm delighted to be here today, and I'm eager to talk about what I think of as a set of paradoxes. We live in an age of extraordinary advancement in nearly every form of knowledge, and yet there's rising doubt about the value of a university education and whether its benefits outweigh its costs, something we'll talk about a little bit later. We have far and away the greatest system of public education in the world, and yet here in the US, the academy is often viewed as an ivory tower cut off from the American people. Americans feel a strong imperative to innovate and compete against the world's rising powers, but we don't invest as fully as we should in our greatest source of innovation, our young people. In this time of fits and starts and unsettled feelings about higher education, the humanities, as all of you well know, have been especially vulnerable to partisan warfare. Unlike the STEM disciplines, they don't, on the surface, contribute to national defense. It's very difficult to measure precisely the effects and value of the humanities for GDP or contributing to employment. And yet, I think all of us in this room know in our bones that the humanities contributes in a very important way to the secular humanism that we value as a nation. And we have to protect the humanities if we're going to continue to be strong in the years ahead. So today, what I thought I might do is talk about ways that we might better make that case, something that I know all of you in this room are eager to do. It's great to see so many defenders from the front lines here today, humanities advocates from state humanities councils, museums, universities, grant writers, grant givers, representatives of the NEH and the NEA. And I'm flattered to be here because, as my introduction indicated, I don't exactly hail from the center of the humanities. I'm an economist, a specialization in health and economic development. I should say in my defense that I took forays through English literature and philosophy on the way to becoming an economist, and my dissertation was inspired by an Ezra Pound canto. So maybe that'll give me some credentials here. But I would say that, economists do have value, I think. And when you invite us to speak, the chances are good that we'll ultimately get around to a very basic question, which is it worth it? And I hope I can answer that today in the affirmative, that not only is support for the humanities worth it, it's essential. We all know that there's been a fair amount of hostility to this idea recently in Congress and in state houses around the country. Sometimes it feels like there's a national alliance against the humanities. There are frequent potshots by right-wing radio commentators. An entire lobby is devoted to reducing government spending, particularly in education and environmental stewardship. And in that light, humanities spending often looks and indeed is vulnerable. Even academics who might be inclined to be sympathetic are piling on. The great Harvard entomologist E.O. Wilson just wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that began, quote, "The task of understanding humanity is too important and too daunting to leave to the humanities." Now, I think, provocative opening, if you read through the op-ed, you would come to a different conclusion. But I think that first sentence kind of strikes a nerve among many of us who are supporters. It's a great curiosity of our recent history that a party that once championed education is now generally hostile to the academic world, and vice versa. This is regrettable for many reasons. We don't want hegemonic thinking inside the academy looking out, or outside the academy looking in. Republicans should be proud of the Morrill Act of 1862, which expanded our peerless system of public universities, and the fact that a former Republican, Earl Warren, presided over the desegregation of our schools. But it has become fashionable to attack government for being out of touch, bloated, and elitist, and humanities funding often strikes critics as an especially muddle-headed form of government spending, which is not made more palatable by the fact that an education in the humanities so often turns out to be an education into liberalism. For that reason, the humanities are in danger of becoming something of a piñata. If you happen to be the governor of a large southern state, say North Carolina or Florida or Texas, then questioning the humanities or of college in general can make for an easy and an effective form of populist politics. In the current economic environment, these attacks have the potential to sway people. We have all seen the bitter debates over the sequester and the fiscal cliff, and producing spending bills does not seem to be getting any easier. Any expenditure clearly has to be worth it. And so we're hearing about performance funding, linking government support to disciplines that provide higher numbers of jobs, or in Florida, a, quote, strategic tuition structure that essentially charges more money to students who want to study the humanities and less money for those going into STEM disciplines. As a result, there's cause for grave concern. And the evidence tells us that federal support of the humanities is heading in the wrong direction. In fiscal year 2012, the NIH was funded at $146 million, down $21 million from FY 2010, at a time when science funding stayed intact. This is part of a pattern of a long-term decline since the Reagan years. So, what can we do to make the case for the humanities? I'd like to begin by saying that despite the occasional, maybe more than occasional, bitterness of partisan politics, I believe that the question is fair. Are the humanities worth it? We should accept this challenge with good cheer and set about investigating the hard facts of the question. Why is it that a humanities degree continues to offer value? And how will its value change in the rapidly changing landscape of the new century? We need to engage in this conversation using all of the humanistic tools at our disposal. We meet in a time of rapid change in the educational world. It's not just the humanities that are under scrutiny. The very enterprise of education is as well. There are those who question the value of a degree at all. There are many who question the high financial cost of a four-year education, and rightly so. There are those who are challenging the idea of college in other ways. We're seeing an extraordinary number of people signing up for online lectures, which borrow from the idea of college without exactly duplicating it. It is certainly not college in the original sense of collegiality, living together. But it is definitely education and accessible. And in its way, it's a harbinger of the tech future we are all heading towards, whether we like it or not. But that doesn't mean we can't take our values with us into that future. And over many centuries, we have learned well what these values are and how profoundly they are linked to the humanities. They stem from the humanities, they are sustained by the humanities. So long as we sustain them, they'll sustain us. At Brown, we're about to celebrate our 250th anniversary and a proud tradition of what I call constructive irreverence. This means listening to dissent, questioning authority, following one's individual conscience, but always within a framework of respect for community. Brown derives some of that ethos from Rhode Island and its particularly ardent defense of religious freedom, but it has been nurtured over the year by the natural eclecticism of its students, and I'm learning from its faculty, and a curriculum that encourages free choice. I've been told that Brown alumnus Ken Roth of Human Rights Watch said that Brown offers good training for the world because there are no rules at Brown, and a good way to prepare for a Hobbesian world where there are no rules either. But obviously, we do have rules and standards, and so does the world. And one of the ways that the world has worked out its standards of civility and respect and honest discourse is through grounding in the humanities. The humanities are not a fungible part of the curriculum that we can casually separate from. They're an essential part of our intellectual pedigree. They ground us and make possible the curiosity and civility and the enlightened skepticism that allows all knowledge to proceed. From the original seven liberal arts of the Middle Ages, grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, and music, we have evolved a complex humanistic discourse that makes possible the endless enterprise of intellectual inquiry. To push back against the recent tide of criticism, I'd like to offer several strategies. Okay, first, we need to argue clearly and forcefully that there are real, tangible benefits to the humanistic disciplines we're talking about, to history, to literature, to art, to drama, to music, to foreign languages and area studies. In the complex, globalized world we're all moving toward, it will obviously benefit American undergraduates to know something of other civilizations, past and present. Any form of immersion in literary expression is obviously helpful when we're learning to communicate and defend our thoughts. And it should not be that difficult to find common ground in Congress that a thorough and objective grounding in history is helpful and even inspiring when applying the lessons of the past to our future. This point came home to me when, in my previous role as Dean of Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School, I went to the university archives to read the reports and correspondence concerned with the formation of the school in 1929. The founding director of the school, DeWitt Clinton Poole, wrote that the need at the time was not for, quote, young men minutely trained in specific technicalities, but instead for a, quote, broad culture that will enlarge the individual's mental scope to world dimensions. Accordingly, the curriculum was designed to ground students in both the social sciences and the humanities, with attention to foreign languages, cultural knowledge, history, political philosophy. At that time, on the eve of the Great Depression, there was concern that such an impractical education would be of little value. Indeed, one alumnus, I read his letter, he wrote that the curriculum is, quote, not immediately useful to the boy who has to earn a living. Yet, if one looks back over the course of the school's rich history, it's evident that many of the men and women who were exposed to that curriculum went on to positions of genuine leadership in the public and private sectors. The same is true at Brown and at any of the other great liberal arts universities that emphasize the humanities. When we think about who we're most proud, well, we celebrate our Pulitzer Prize-winning authors, Nilo Cruz, Jeffrey Eugenides, our activists, Cecile Richard, president of Planned Parenthood, Ira Magaziner, now heading the Clinton Health Access Initiative. And when I ask any of our business leaders what they valued most during their time at Brown, I am just as likely to hear about an inspiring classics professor or a thought-provoking course in religion as I am courses in economics, science, or mathematics. We know that one of the best aspects of the undergraduate experience is the fact that it is so multifaceted, that it's so integrated. Our scientists enjoy studying along with our humanists and vice versa. They learn more that way, and they do better on each side of that not very precise divide. Second, we need to better defend an important principle that centuries of humanism have taught us, that we don't always know the future benefits of what we study, and therefore we should not rush to reject some forms of research as being less deserving than others. One of my favorite essays was written by Abraham Flexner, the founding director of the Institute for Advanced Studies. The title of this essay, which caught my eye immediately, was The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge. It was published in Harper's in 1939, on the eve of World War II, a time when we can assume that there was high priority placed on military and scientific knowledge. In that essay, Flexner argued that most of our most significant discoveries have been made by, quote, men and women who were driven not by the desire to be useful, but merely the desire to satisfy their curiosity. Flexner's essay underscores a very important idea, that random discoveries can be more important than the ones we think we're looking for, and that we should be wary of imposing standard criteria of costs and benefits on our scholars. In other words, we should be careful not to give the economists too much power. Or perhaps I should put it more precisely, we certainly want to know that benefits will accrue from all of the research and conversations taking place on a lively college campus, but we should be prepared to accept that this value may be very difficult to measure, and it may not be clear for decades or even centuries. After 9/11, experts in Arabic and the history and culture of Islam were suddenly in very high demand. Their years of research could not simply be invented overnight. Similarly, we know that regional leaders like Brazil, Indonesia, and South Africa will rise in relevance and connectivity to the United States over the next few decades, just as China and India already have. To be ready for these relationships and to advance them, we need to have the humanities fully engaged. Third, the pace of learning is moving so quickly that I would argue that it is all the more important that we maintain support for the humanities precisely to make sure we remain grounded in our core values. As many previous generations have learned, innovations in science and technology are tremendously important, but they inevitably bring adjustments with them and create unintended consequences, some good, some bad. Some new inventions, if only available to small numbers, increase in inequity and competition for scarce resources with multiplying effects. We need humanists to help us understand and respond to the social and ethical dimensions of technological change. Another paradox of our time is that the faster we communicate, it often seems the worse we communicate. We need humanists for so many reasons, but one is simply to help our teenagers send more interesting messages than OMG and LOL. As more changes come, we will need humanists to help us filter them, calibrate them, and when necessary, correct them. And we need them to galvanize the changes that are yet to come. Universities should not merely train students who can survive and prosper in the world as it is. Instead, we have to educate students who can change the world for the better. Our focus should not only be on training students with the skills that are needed immediately upon graduating from college. The value of those skills is going to depreciate very quickly over time. Instead, our aim must be to invest in the long-term intellectual, creative, and social capacity of human beings. And I would argue that the humanities are an essential part of that. The good news is that universities are not going anywhere. Despite the occasional, or maybe more than occasional, criticism, they'll be here for a long time and the humanities with them. Universities are not nearly as impractical or extravagant as their critics sometimes intimate. A college degree, now here's the economics, remains an extremely good investment. The economic return to a year of college is about 10%, and if anything, has increased in recent years. Yes, humanities majors do tend to earn less on average than their counterparts in the sciences and engineering. However, these differences may be less than many people think. Data from the Census Bureau indicates that adults who received a bachelor's degree in science and engineering-related fields and who don't go on to a more advanced degree can expect to earn $2.6 million over the course of their careers, in contrast to $2.1 million for those with degrees in literature and languages. That's only about $11,000 per year over a lifetime of work. And those with degrees in literature and languages are more likely to continue to advance degrees, which result in higher earnings levels, further shrinking the gap between humanities majors and those in other disciplines. So I would argue that the economic argument against the humanities disciplines is not very strong. I suspect that the humanities will hold their own in an increasingly technological age. Walter Isaacson's best-selling biography of Steve Jobs argued that Jobs loved to position himself at exactly the intersection of technology and art. No one would have mistaken him for a computer programmer or an engineer or a graphic designer, but somehow he combined all of these and more to revolutionize one industry after another. I believe that the ability to creatively integrate knowledge across a range of disciplines will become increasingly valuable in the years to come. I started by saying that we should embrace the debate about the value of the humanities. So let's hear the criticisms that are often leveled and do what we can to address them. Let's make sure we give value to our students and that we educate them for a variety of possible outcomes, including the possibility that they won't find a job in their chosen discipline immediately after leaving college. Let's do more to encourage cross-pollination between the sciences and the humanities for the benefit of both. And let's educate all of our students in every discipline to use the best humanistic tools we've acquired over a millennium of university teaching to engage in a civilized discourse about all of the great issues of our time. The more conclusively that science proves we are damaging our atmosphere, the less we seem to be able to talk about it. The growing sophistication of cloning techniques has brought scientists closer to the technology of life itself, but the science is advancing far faster than our vocabulary. There are hard questions coming at us all the time, from all angles, relating to new military weapons, cyber warfare, surveillance and security, human rights, marriage, the economy, justice. Many hard questions. A grounding in the humanities will sharpen our answers. More to the point, we want a thriving, scintillating civil society in which everyone can talk to everyone. That was the quality that Alexis de Tocqueville talked about when he visited the United States at the beginning of the 1830s. Even in that primitive time, before the internet, before the telegraph, we were engaged in an American conversation that stretched from one end of the country to another. We don't want a nation of technical experts in one subject. We want politicians who have read Shakespeare, as Lincoln did. We want bankers and lawyers who have read Homer and Dante. Dante, I think especially, given his expertise on the different circles of hell. We want factory owners who have read Dickens. It's really important to get this right, for the next century will be defined not by what we know, but by how we know. Colleges are changing, but if anything, they're more important than ever. A mountain of empirical evidence indicates a growing inequality in our society, rising to levels not seen since just before the Great Depression. There is no better way to check this trend than to invest in education, the great equalizer. And there's no better way to invest in education than to invest fairly, giving attention to all disciplines and short shrift to none. Earlier generations have weighed these questions and answered in the affirmative. An early graduate of Brown, Horace Mann, trained in the humanities, launched our public school system. He knew that a broad secular education, open to all, was one of the foundations of our democracy, and that it was impossible to expect meaningful citizenship without offering people the tools to inform themselves about all of the great questions in life. Horace Mann said, quote, "Be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for humanity." In that spirit, let's continue this conversation, eager to engage the critics in a spirited conversation whose very richness depends on the humanistic values we cherish. So in conclusion, yes, it's worth it, and thank you. I would be delighted to take some questions from the audience, if there's time. Yeah? Yes, sir.
I wonder, I appreciated that very much, and particularly your arguments on how we should talk to the public. One of the things we're not so good at in humanities is evaluating ourselves. Of course, most of us aren't. Would you say a couple of things from your perspective as an economist about what we haven't done so well in the humanities, just to help us with our perspective on that?
If you're asking me to give a criticism of the critique of the entire humanities, no, please. I wouldn't want to do that. Thank you very much. Well, I mean, I think when research in the humanities has come under fire, we have not been very good at articulating what its value is. I think, you know, the nature of research, and this is true in the humanities, but in other disciplines as well, is that, you know, there are a lot to make progress. You go down a lot of blind alleys. You know, just by its nature, research means you're looking into new areas, and some things are going to work well and some things aren't. So I think, you know, the expectations for the public about what it means to do research, what scholarship means, people don't really have a good sense of that. So, you know, somehow if we can educate people about the fact that, you know, research and scholarship is a slow process. As I said, you know, what we learn today may not be valuable for 10, 20, 30, 100 years. Trying to persuade people that this is a slow process that requires patience, I think is important. I don't know how easy it is to do that, honestly. And I think, you know, science is catchier because you can always come up with some new, you know, it seems much more discrete in terms of what's being learned. Although I would say there are as many blind alleys in science as there are in social sciences and humanities. So, you're welcome. Other questions? Yes.
Thank you very much for a wonderful address. I hope you don't mind my asking what is sort of an obvious question, but especially given your background in economics, how do you address the growing challenge of the very high tuition associated with liberal arts and especially private colleges and universities, and the challenge that many undergraduates face, particularly upon graduation and grappling with loans and so forth?
Right. I mean, the cost of university education, it's a huge issue, and I think all of us, any university president is grappling with it. You know, I would say a couple points. One is, you know, many of us, to the extent that we're able, are really putting more and more into financial aid. And you actually look at the net price of tuition, which is tuition net of financial aid. For many students, and the net price of going to Brown has gone down over the last decade. So, you know, in some ways what we've done is we've adopted a somewhat more progressive tuition system where those whose family incomes are relatively higher paying more, and those whose family incomes are middle class and lower are paying less. That seems like a good thing. I think, you know, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't watch our costs very carefully. We are a very labor-intensive industry. You know, the big chunk of everything that we spend money on is salaries and benefits. And especially faculty salaries have been increasing at slightly greater than the rate of inflation. Healthcare costs have been a component there too. So, you know, trying to keep down the costs is a challenge, a continual challenge. Brown, and I know many other universities, are really committed to the principle that students should have access to Brown regardless of their economic circumstances. And continuing to put a high premium on financial aid is just, it's really important to me. I think it's very important overall. The idea of sort of great bloat and waste, I can only speak for my own university. I spend a lot of time looking over the numbers. We can always make improvements, but I don't see that as being one of the driving factors in increasing costs. Thank you. Yes.
I had a couple of questions to ask. As a person from the state of North Carolina, I can say that our governor, who got a degree from a liberal arts college, told Bill Bennett that he thought that liberal arts education was fine for people who go to private schools, but public universities should be more engaged in the manufacturing of graduates who would get immediate jobs. So I wondered what you perceive as this, what it seems to be a growing sense of, well, the liberal arts are okay for the people who are able to pay for them, but other people who are going to public universities, such as the university where I teach, should be expecting to get more of a kind of jobs training. Second question, if you have time to mention it at all, I understand that Eric Cantor is proposing cuts or actually defunding by the federal government of social science research. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you have any comments on that, and how would that relate to our situation?
Right, right. So, yes. So one question is, you know, should public universities be more kind of focused immediately on jobs upon graduation, and private universities have the luxury of doing things differently? You know, I don't like that argument. I think that, you know, I am an economist, and I think markets actually matter. And students make career choices based on what their preferences are, what their interests are, and what they see in terms of their earnings over the course of their lives. And, you know, the idea that, you know, training in the humanities, where a lot of those people are going into teaching and law, are these not socially well, law, I'm married to a lawyer, but law is good. But you know, the idea that you're making broad judgments about whole classes of occupations that people go into just doesn't make any sense to me. You know, the market forces, salary differentials, they're going to guide choices, and they may steer people at some points in time to some types of majors and concentrations and others at other times, and that's fine. But the idea that we additionally need to give them extra prompts over and above what they see in the marketplace doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. The other argument that I would make is that, you know, there really is something very fundamental about the idea that skills depreciate quickly. There's a difference between training and education. And training, which provides specific skills, is a very good thing, but training is something that people have to expect to do over the course of their entire lives, especially in an economy where there's rapid technological progress. Education is something different. Education gives you the capacity to change, to think, and indeed to have, you know, to be able to retrain and retool over the course of your lives. So I'm not a big fan of only focusing on technical training and not giving students the capacity to retool at the same time. They'll find themselves in a not very good position later on. Defunding the social sciences, you know, I think social scientists are now going to be in the position increasingly of having to make the same type of arguments that humanists have been making for a long time, that what they do is valuable, that it does count. You know, I look at a lot of the research in economics around, I don't know, tax policy, pension policy, economic development, health economics. It's kind of hard, coming from a policy-focused area myself, not to think that these ideas are actually pretty important for answering some of the most vital questions of our time. So I think that, you know, social scientists will gear up and they'll make the case as best they can. But it's going to be a difficult economic climate. We all know that. Thank you. Yes.
Thanks very much for your talk. I wanted to ask you a question about a remark you made about research that is aimed at the future where you don't know for sure what the payoff will be of that research. Mm-hmm. It strikes me that a lot of what's called basic science now it also is in the position of having to argue that we're doing basic research, but we don't know 10, 20, 50 years out whether this will be valuable. I'd love to hear your thoughts about whether there's a potential alliance with our colleagues in the sciences who are not doing applied research, some of whom are suffering from the same kind of inattention or credibility gap when they talk about the value of their research.
I think that's right. And you know, one of the things I love about Brown is seeing this real level of collegiality and appreciation across the sciences, social science, and humanities. It's a very distinctive aspect of the institution. And I expect that you would get broad agreement among my colleagues there. You know, when I think about examples, I mean, not too long ago, one of my colleagues came in with a case of moon rocks that were picked up in the 1970s by one of the missions to the moon, not to Mars. And, you know, was telling me how when these things were picked up, no one really knew quite what they were. They were rock collecting. And now here it is, decades later, and they're actually able to take new instruments, new methods of analyzing these materials and developing new insights about water on the moon, the development of the moon. So, you know, things that we never could have imagined at that time. And, you know, you can go through and find example after example of that. So, you know, yes, I think there is the capacity for building that alliance and saying, you know, what when we first discovered it, did we not know what would come of it, you know, 40, 50, 60, 100 years later? And that's valuable. Yeah, thanks. Yes?
Again, thank you for your talk. One of the things that strikes me about so often what we do is that we who are invested in the humanities go make the pitch about the importance of the humanities. I don't know a lot about communication theory, but one thing I have learned from my colleagues is that sometimes a certain messenger cannot deliver a message. When I begin to open my mouth, they say, oh, there's the dean from the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. What else is he going to say? Where can we find colleagues who could be viewed as legitimate messengers to carry this message, perhaps from private industry, from other disciplines, and so on?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I think that, again, looking to colleagues within universities that are not in the humanities is probably a bit of a start, although frankly, I think all universities are suspect right now. So going outside of that, I'll tell you, one example at Brown that I think is quite wonderful is we've now partnered with an international business school to do an MBA. You think, MBA, what's that got to do with humanities? The reason why it's so popular is that when the students come and spend time at Brown, they sort of spend time at different places. They're coming because they're getting a grounding in the arts and humanities. They're learning about culture, they're learning about creativity. And, if you can find business leaders who appreciate the broader skill set that they need to do their jobs well, I think that would be good. One of our board members is a, banker, very high-level banker. And when you ask him what he looks for when he hires young people, he's not looking for economics courses. He's not looking for accounting. He's looking for people who can think and write and who are creative and who have critical thinking skills. So, it may be that there's a coalition out there among people in business, among people in public policy, who can speak to the skill set that is cultivated through the humanities. And you're right, that would probably be more effective than here comes another humanist telling me that what he or she does is valuable. Yeah. Yes?
Well, I have a follow-up to that question. So it's not just who's a helpful messenger that we're not thinking of, but what audience do we need to get to? Because I'm very concerned that at my university, the University of Delaware, we're seeing high school seniors coming in with a disinclination toward the humanities. How do we get to parents, high school students? I mean, is it guidance counselors? Are we talking to the wrong people, right? So not just the wrong spokespeople, but the wrong audience too.
So there is a national trend against majoring in the humanities. It's been going down for a while, just a slide down. I think it's really hard. I mean, I get students, I'll just give you an example. One of the very first things I did this year was I talked to a group of students who'd come back to campus early to participate in a public service project, and all freshmen. And I was just asking them what they're doing, what are you going to do? And I said, are you worried about your jobs when you leave here? And they all sort of raised their hand, a lot of them did. And I said, well, who's really worried? Is it you or is it your parents? And they said, well, it's our parents, And I think there is a lot of pressure on the part of parents for kids to go in, and there's a lot of focus on the college major, to major in things that will get the job the day after you leave. So what can you do to get around that? I mean, one thing that we're thinking of doing is actually putting more of an emphasis on career advice and mentoring and internship opportunities, so that at the same time saying, yes, all that's important. We'll do that for you. We'll help you with that. But in exchange, you should be able to go out and you should be able to do what you love doing. If we bring in the mentors who can talk to the students and say, you know what, I was a religion major and here's where I am now. I think that's the sort of information we need to get to. I don't think that educating parents is going to get us too far. And also when you deal with college students, they make their own minds up anyway. So I think, really educating them on what they can do with what they're getting to show them that it's a broader world out there. As an economist, I know that one thing that's happened since 2008 is that at Brown, at Princeton, at Harvard, at universities around the country, students are flooding into the economics major, so much so that the economists are trying to say, come on, enough already. We want students who want to be here because they love the subject, not because they think it's just going to get them a job. And so there's a lot of support within universities to try to push students back and make them feel comfortable doing what they love. But in this uncertain economic environment, it's going to take some work to do that. Yeah. Back here.
Carol Schneider, Association of American Colleges and Universities. There's a certain tension, I think, both in your wonderful remarks and also in the questions we're asking now, and I wanted to ask you to probe it a little further. Both your own career and all the examples you gave of the ways in which the humanities are essential, necessary, really exemplify a kind of blend of learning across disciplines. Problem-centered, inquiry-centered, rather than discipline-anchored learning. And we do a lot of work with employers, and our surveys have shown, and we're about to release a new one, in which employers are asking for blends of liberal and applied learning. Mm-hmm. They don't want just knowledge, they don't want just skill, they want both. But our self-defense goes to how do we get them to major in religion or literature or history or one of the humanities. And aren't we really in a mode where we're talking about how can we construct forms of advanced study that are not discipline-specific, but in fact allow students to tackle important questions, drawing on the insights of the humanities and other fields as well?
Well, I think you're right that maybe the focus on the college major is a little bit, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And especially when you hear, the idea of, charging students different tuitions depending on what they go into, which is a little crazy. I do think that for undergraduates, there's a focus. I mean, what I value is the real honing of critical thinking skills, which requires really deep knowledge, really pushing yourself into the analysis of some subject. I think you can learn that from studying poetry. I think you can do that through studying philosophy, through economics, through science. There's something about cultivating kind of disciplined habits of mind that let you think through clearly different subjects. And there, I'm almost discipline neutral. It's something that I want any student to come out from university or college with. The crosstalk across the disciplines, I also, so I'm actually in favor of majors. I think students really should kind of delve deeply into one topic. But I do think that there's value in the crosstalk across disciplines. And, one thing I've come to appreciate at Brown is when you talk to most students and you say, what are you, they're not majors, they're concentrators. What are you concentrating in? And most of them will tell you two things. And it might be, biology and literature, or they put things together in amazingly creative ways. And they make up their own value in seeing how those two play off of each other. And at the same time, students are very engaged in extracurricular subjects. They're out there doing things in the world. So, I guess I see university, really, college, as an experience where you're blending the applied with the critical thinking skills that you can get from multiple disciplines. So, having the faculty there who can educate students across a range is tremendous, no matter what disciplines they're concentrating in. I don't know if that's a coherent answer to your question, but I guess what I'm saying is I do think that delving deeply into one subject area is important, and having that nested with a good kind of cross-disciplinary perspective is something that's terrific for students. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Speaking from political science, we have one foot in the social sciences and one foot in the humanities. Mm-hmm. And it occurs to me that the conversations are often very different. When we talk about relevance of social science, we often talk about policy. And how do we get social scientists to speak more clearly to policymakers and to get policymakers to listen? when we talk about the humanities, we tend to talk about students and about careers and about relevance in the sort of life cycle or with the public, and rarely with policy. How can we, and what is the promise of getting humanists to speak more directly to policymakers, to be more engaged overtly in the policy process, be perceived as a relevant part of that, and to get policymakers to listen?
Well, I mean, I actually think there are huge opportunities for humanists to be involved in policy. And, you know, in some disciplines, some areas, it's more obvious than others. Political philosophy, ethics, I mean, these are areas where they're essential to thinking through numerous policy issues. I mean, we're talking now about, you know, the ethics of drones. How do you think about that without thinking about it within some moral framework? Very difficult. I was talking to one of our scholars who studies the Inquisition, and she had some really interesting things to say about what we know about whether you get truthful information through torture. She said, you know, you don't have to look at recent evidence. You can look at evidence from a long time ago, and you can learn a lot. So I think, you know, it may be useful to think in groups like this about how humanists can realize the value of what they say. Maybe they don't always realize how relevant it is. And learning how to make those connections, to kind of speak out more, to build connections into the policy world would be a useful thing to do. I don't know quite how to do that, but if people can think of a way to do that, I think it would be a good thing. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Shane
Hi.
Mormon. I'm from the Department of Communication at California State University, Fresno. And your public speaking teacher says you've done a very good job today, so good job.
Thank you.
The question I have is about the Bologna process. And it, of course, is a process that began in Europe and seems to be spreading to China as well, and seems to be knocking on the door of the United States and asking us to reconceive how long our students spend getting a bachelor's degree, et cetera. And so it seems that, at least on the West Coast, some universities are starting to consider whether or not we should shorten the length of degree for undergraduate students. And so I was just curious about your own perspective on the Bologna process and how it's being dealt with at Brown University and what impact this may or may not have on the humanities.
Right. You know, it's so funny. I'll give my one sort of economist view of this. In a time of high unemployment, the opportunity of cost of going to college is at its lowest. It's the worst time to shorten time to degree. Doesn't make any sense, but that's okay. We'll put that aside. I do think that, you know, we're all thinking about being more flexible in terms of time to degree. As part of the strategic planning process that we're undertaking right now, we've been talking about whether we should think about a 3-year degree that could, you know, there could be some summer work, there could be online courses, you know, you could pack it in. When we talk to members of the community about this idea, the people who really dislike it the most intensely are the students. You know, the students value their time. They value, I think, the spaces in between the semesters when they go out and do things that are relevant to what they're doing in the classroom. And really seem distraught at the idea that some students would have a worse experience by having a shortened time to degree. You know, that said, financial pressures being what they are, if a shorter time to degree can mean much less in the way of tuition over the course of a career, you know, maybe it's worth thinking about. There's nothing magical about 4 years. You know, something from 3 years, maybe even stretching it out up to 5 years so that students can take time off to work as they go to college. And that's happening anyway, as we know. So, you know, I'm not really averse to the idea of more flexibility in order to accommodate students' interests in their budgets and their preferences. But I do think that it's going to be the students who you hear from who are the most kind of unhappy about that idea. I don't see why it would affect the humanities any more or less than other disciplines. Maybe you had something specific in mind? No? Okay. Thank you. Yes?
Thank you so much for your remarks. It's wonderful to have a university leader joining forces with us.
Thank you.
We need all the help we can get. You just mentioned online courses, and I wondered if you could just share your thoughts about something you've probably been asked about,
Yeah.
which is what do you see as the role of, especially of the massive open online course in higher education, but especially with reference to the humanities?
Right. I mean, Brown is doing what most universities are doing right now, which is experimenting. So we have some MOOCs, and we have some flipped classrooms, and we have some online courses that we're developing just for Brown. We have this business, i.e. Partnership for an MBA that is partly in person, partly online, so it's a blended product. So, where will we be in 5 years? I really don't know. We don't know yet how well students learn from these different types of opportunities. We don't know yet whether they work well for some disciplines and less well for others. I think there might be great potential for using online teaching for language learning, for example. I doubt that's going to happen through the massive open online courses, because I think those are the types of skills where you do need something much more intensive, but you can imagine an online component that will work pretty well. We're offering this summer a writing course online where, again, it's a small number of students, it's not a massive course, but when you're involved in writing, actually the online format where students can write and share what they're writing with each other and with their professor is not a bad thing. So, we're experimenting, and we'll see. I think everybody knows that, the massive open online courses have a couple real problems. One is, to the extent that they're free, they have incredibly high dropout rates. Students don't stay in them till the end, a very small fraction do. Second, it's hard to know how to assess students. You can do sort of online tests, but you don't really know who's taking them. There's so the credentialing has some hurdles that have to be crossed. And then frankly, I think people are really worried about whether the quality of discourse that happens in a classroom can ever really be mimicked in an online space. Maybe I'm just the wrong generation. I don't see how it can be, but maybe it can be. And I think we need to, again, say, look, let's look at this, let's experiment, let's see how far we can get, and decide what works well and what doesn't work well, and go from there. So I'm all for that. But I'm a little bit skeptical about where we'll end up. So thanks. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Good morning. I would just like to draw a sort of a line between something you said and the question that the dean over here had about who can be our best advocates, right? Mm-hmm. Who's the trustworthy messenger? I don't want this to devolve into a series of anecdotes, of course, but I teach at St. Mary's College of California, which is a small Catholic university, and I'm thinking of a particular student who graduated a couple years ago, majoring in accounting, minoring in theology. She was an incredibly intelligent and articulate advocate for the particular combination of job training and pure education that she was receiving, right? So we can ask ourselves, who knows why these kids are doing this? They do in many cases, right? So if you asked her, she could explain to you at great length, in fact, why her inquiry into theology was going to make her a better accountant, not a more skilled accountant, but a better one, a more ethical one. So I think sometimes we sit in a room together and we ask ourselves, why are people doing this? Why are people not doing this? But ask the man who owns one, as Packard Automobiles used to say, right? In many cases, the students can explain for themselves why they're doing it.
Well, it's interesting. We had a TEDx conference at Brown on the value of liberal learning. And, a combination of people spoke, but some of the students who were involved made just incredibly compelling cases. And, you know, maybe it is an idea of, you know, trying to put together groups of people who have gone on to do wonderful things, clearly valuable things, and have them make a case publicly about what their humanistic training did for them. I think I agree with you. Yeah, good antidote.